I apologize, but I speak in Portuguese. Okay? Meus caros amigos, nós vamos iniciar agora um painel que trata da perspectiva e do panorama das leis internacionais na remuneração do conteúdo jornalístico pelas plataformas de internet. Estão conosco, para nossa alegria e nossa honra, né, o Sean Donilon, que é o Executive Vice President of Government Relations da NAB. Nice to see you again. E, para nossa satisfação, o Kevin Desjardins, President of the Canadian Association of Broadcasters. It's an honor for us. Eu gostaria de iniciar, não podia deixar de referir aqui, por uma questão pessoal, me permitam, foi muito citado aqui um desastre ambiental que está acontecendo no Brasil, no estado do Rio Grande do Sul, que é o meu estado natal, o meu estado de origem, e que está vivendo talvez uma das piores provações de toda a sua história, desde a guerra de 1835. É uma devastação total e absoluta do estado. É uma consternação, uma tristeza de ver a minha terra naquele estado de absoluta destruição. Mas é preciso ressaltar aqui, como foi dito, que no meio desta destruição, no meio deste pânico, sem energia, sem acesso por estrada, sem nada, a única coisa que manteve as pessoas conectadas ao mundo foi o rádio. Por quê? Ainda que não tivesse energia, tinha os automóveis com as suas baterias e tinha o rádio de vídeo. Então, no meio dessa tristeza, mostra a relevância do meio rádio e a importância do meio rádio, especificamente nas crises e nas catástrofes que acontecem no mundo afora. Mas nós estamos aqui para tratar deste tema que foi ontem amplamente discutido na reunião do Conselho Diretivo da IR e que resultou em um documento aprovado por unanimidade, que trata justamente destas assimetrias, trata dessa questão que vai mais longe do que um tema de assimetria regulatória, mas e um tema que é um problema para os veículos de comunicação, mas vai mais longe, é um problema para a saúde das nossas sociedades, para a saúde dos nossos países, para a saúde dos nossos povos. Então, o jornalismo profissional tem atuado como um verdadeiro certificador de conteúdos de desinformação, verificando as informações divulgadas nos meios digitais e veiculando fatos devidamente verificados. Este fenômeno global transformou as redações jornalísticas e exigiu do jornalismo profissional uma atuação transversal, dinâmica e atualizada, no contexto de rápidas mudanças tecnológicas. A valorização do jornalismo profissional permite a produção de informação fiável, crucial para combater a desinformação e garantir a democracia. Existe uma tendência global para exigir o pagamento das plataformas tecnológicas por serviços jornalísticos. A União Europeia, por exemplo, expandiu a proteção dos direitos de autor para garantir que as plataformas remunerem os jornais. A Austrália, Canadá e França adotaram regras que estabelecem um sistema comercial, além do Brasil, que o tema é discutido no Reino Unido e aqui nos Estados Unidos. São pontos de atenção e abordagem gerais específicas. A urgência de um entendimento global, que envolva governos democráticos, organizações jornalísticas e grandes empresas digitais para implementar rapidamente as regras de pagamento do jornalismo profissional pelas grandes tecnologias. Experiências internacionais na regulação da remuneração jornalística pelas plataformas de internet. A possibilidade de utilizar a autorregulação para chegar a um acordo entre plataformas tecnológicas e organizações jornalísticas. Na Austrália, há regulamentações pioneiras e avanços em acordos foram inspirados nas discussões sobre o tema no Brasil e em Portugal. Além disso, é necessária a criação de bases legais para promover a transparência das plataformas e das novas tecnologias digitais. As plataformas devem garantir uma remuneração justa pelo uso de conteúdos noticiosos de propriedade de empresas jornalísticas e de mídia, em benefício da sustentabilidade do ambiente digital e do desenvolvimento de empresas jornalísticas regularmente constituídas. A garantia de remuneração justa das plataformas digitais pelo uso de conteúdos informativos de propriedade de empresas jornalísticas e meios de comunicação não exclui acordos bilaterais entre as partes ou qualquer outro tipo de negociação formal. As plataformas digitais devem reconhecer o jornalismo e os meios de comunicação como fundamentais e indispensáveis para a divulgação de notícias e informações, a formação da opinião pública, a valorização e a promoção da cultura de cada região e a preservação da identidade nacional. As plataformas digitais devem promover mecanismos que permitam aos meios de comunicação social e a outros grupos de comunicação social bloquear a utilização indevida e não remunerada dos conteúdos jornalísticos protegidos. As plataformas digitais devem implementar mecanismos para garantir que não haja violação do direito à remuneração pelos conteúdos. As empresas de tecnologia devem também entrar em negociações formais e acordos com entidades dos meios de comunicação para promover o uso de conteúdo sem dados sem violar a lei. E a discussão sobre a remuneração do conteúdo jornalístico não deve ser feita apenas como uma remuneração de direitos autorais, mas em um contexto de combate à desinformação, mantendo o jornalismo como ferramenta de sustentação da democracia, incluindo os aspectos competitivos de concentração da publicidade digital das plataformas. A remuneração é o resultado e a contrapartida do uso de conteúdos profissionais explorado pelas plataformas digitais, mesmo que indiretamente. Devem ser previstas medidas para assegurar o pagamento de conteúdos jornalísticos pelas plataformas digitais, bem como medidas para evitar a retirada arbitrária ou redução de tráfego de conteúdos jornalísticos para efeitos de não pagamento. As regras devem ser desenvolvidas com base em princípios universais de interesse público, pluralidade, diversidade, sustentabilidade, equidade, coletividade, independência, transparência, prestação de contas e resultados. Dada esta introdução, eu acho que temos aqui uma grande possibilidade de ouvir os nossos dois painelistas que vão discorrer sobre as experiências e as iniciativas que acontecem nesses dois grandes países do nosso continente, que é os Estados Unidos da América e o Canadá. E chamo a atenção para o Canadá, que tem uma legislação muito desenvolvida neste tema, e estamos ansiosos para ouvir. Os nossos painelistas terão 10 minutos para a sua exposição e depois as perguntas serão abertas à plateia. Eu abro este painel passando a palavra aos nossos dois painelistas, iniciando pelo Sean Donilon, que é Executive Vice President and Government Relations da ABERT. Sean.
Thank you, and thank you for the partnership. This is a very important discussion. I'm going to start by framing the issue of it as we see it in the United States. But we start with the exact same themes, which is trusted news and information is the antidote to misinformation and disinformation. So in the United States, study after study finds that local news, local broadcast news, is the most trusted source of news for Americans, for United States citizens. And why is that? We have an ethos of just the facts. So I hope while you're here, you're watching WJLA, you're listening to WTOP. These are phenomenal sources of information in our community here in Washington, D.C. News is expensive to produce, and it's as much as 1/3 of a station's expenses. And that may be obvious in the television context, particularly in a city as large as Washington, D.C., where we have news helicopters, traffic helicopters. It's also expensive for radio as well. 3/4 of radio stations groups operate a newsroom in the United States. On average, these stations air and produce 92 minutes of news each day. So while a free press is essential to democracy, news gathering, news production is not free. The most significant costs for our newsrooms are people, also known as journalists. Shouldn't forget that point. When the general manager of WTOP here in DC testified before the United States Senate, he said every marginal dollar of revenue that they get, net revenue at WTOP, is invested in the newsroom, and in particular in digital. These are the stakes right now. Yet broadcasters are not fairly compensated when our content is accessed on dominant digital platforms. The NAB commissioned a study and found that over $2 billion annually in the United States is lost by broadcasters to just 2 platforms, Google search and the Facebook newsfeed. Others in the news print world have estimated this to be even larger for their industry. So that is a conservative estimate. What is this a feature of? It's take it or leave it dominance by the big tech platforms when it comes to negotiations with local broadcasters. So whether it's reporting on flooding in Brazil, think of the practical scenario here. You send news gatherers, helicopters to the site of the crisis. Put yourselves in harm's way. Produce a professional product that can inform the government, but citizens. And I found out about that last night in depth by doing a Google search. Most broadcasters are not compensated when that content is accessed on the dominant platforms. There's no return path. Is Google sending any of their generated advertising dollars via news reporting, news gathering to these sites or crises? No. They're reproducing and distributing our content. And without that return path, we have a critical problem. Very pleased to hear the policymakers here today recognize that as a problem, which we know not only in the United States, but internationally. So how do we reinvest? And there are a few lessons that we don't have to go into, but I'll flag. In the United States, we have a decreasing newsprint industry. The local newspaper industry has been decimated. I'm proud that local broadcasters have stepped up to fill those gaps in many ways, but that is a very concerning story and trajectory that we should learn lessons from. And then that's a business concern, but for our communities, for our neighbors, what is the civic impact if there is no one available to hold power to account? And I think that is absolutely fundamental to our free society and free democracy. So in the United States, there are a few landscape details I'd like to share on big tech policies. Unlike elsewhere, these companies, the big tech companies, they are US companies. So that has an impact on our policy considerations as well as the politics. And if you think that's just sort of a nicety, look at the recent example of TikTok and legislation that the president has signed to require their divestiture. And obviously, there is a national security amendment to that sped that legislative proposal through the United States Congress. So there's a general concern amongst US policymakers of big tech's impact on our society, particularly when it comes to our children, protecting them from harmful content that can affect their mental health and development, as well as what can happen to our democratic institutions. I don't need to belabor the misinformation and disinformation points that have already been made. We also have a partisan divide that's apparent in US politics. Republicans look at a big tech problem and want to solve for what they perceive as censorship of conservative voices on social media. Democrats, the Democratic Party on the other hand, wants to focus on how to stop the spread of misinformation and disinformation. And those philosophies have different impacts on what is politically possible, where is the consensus. And there's a kernel of consensus when you focus on the size of these platforms, and the next panel is going to focus more on asymmetric regulations and legal and regulatory frameworks that really the big tech companies have outstripped. But when we have a world where any one of Amazon, Apple, Facebook, or Google is larger than the entire US broadcast industry combined, we have an uneven playing field. And so the consensus in the United States, while it's not unanimous, has been around, and I keep saying, big tech, it is around antitrust and competition policy. So that's not just through enforcement by our antitrust enforcement agencies, the Department of Justice, the Federal Trade Commission, but it's also policymakers considering new laws and regulations to account for the immediacy of this issue. If you haven't noticed, antitrust litigation in the United States can take decades. So that arrives us at the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act. Curtis mentioned it as our top priority in this space, and we've gotten some great bipartisan traction. This effort echoes of other international efforts, like the Australian Bargaining Code, and it aligns with other focus efforts in the United States on these big tech, big four companies, Apple, Amazon, Facebook, Google. In the last Congress in particular, there was tremendous focus on things like Amazon Marketplace self-preferencing their products vis-a-vis competitors when they also own the platform. So we leaned into that in the United States and said, well, if policymakers generally have consensus on antitrust and competition and generally disfavor and distrust these biggest of the four companies, how can we operate within that realm of what is realistic and realistically possible? The Journalism Competition and Preservation Act, like others, is a market-based approach. Really, it's designed to level the playing field between news content creators and these big four companies. At its core, it's an antitrust exemption. So it's not a punitive policy or breaking up the big four companies, but rather it would enable news content creators, otherwise market competitors, to jointly negotiate against the big four. And the fundamental concept is that can create scale and level the playing field. I mentioned any one, and it's worth re-emphasizing, any one of these four companies is larger than the entire US broadcast industry combined. So we have bipartisan support. In the last Congress, the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act was the closest of any of the big tech proposals to reach enactment. We were not successful in getting it over that finish line, but we have some tremendous champions still. We talked about that And until the TikTok bill passed, really it was the shining example of the confluence of concern about big tech and addressing changes that could impact our democracy and our society in a beneficial way. What are the features of the JCPA? Broadcasters, other news content creators, news publishers are eligible entities, and you can opt in. There are a few exclusions for the largest US-based news content creators, the largest newspapers, things like Wall Street Journal, LA Times, Washington Post, as well as the national broadcast networks. But the concept is to now enable local news outlets to scale up through a joint negotiation. And fundamentally, it's voluntary for news content creators. So if a news content creator thought they could negotiate bilaterally with one of these companies and reach a better deal, they're freely entitled to do so outside the construct of this framework. It would apply to these big four, big tech companies, and only for the negotiation of compensation when our content is accessed on their digital platforms. It's not broader than that. So it's a marketplace negotiation. You say, well, if Google is not even going to answer the phone when Hubbard WTOP calls here in DC and says, my content is being accessed and distributed via the Facebook newsfeed, well, why is this going to change the outcome? There's important requirements that both parties negotiate in good faith and both parties make a reasonable offer based on marketplace efforts and evidence. There's also important provisions that ensure news content creators can't exclude or discriminate against other news content creators. If you form a collective, you need to allow similarly situated entities to join the collective. It also ensures that a platform can't retaliate against a news content creator for opting into this framework. Newspapers sought an additional remedy. At the end of that, broadcasters think that would be meaningful in the marketplace. Newspapers sought a binding arbitration backstop to ensure that a deal is reached. And this framework, important to note, would be time limited. It's not in perpetuity. The United States Congress would have to evaluate its impact, modify it to ensure it's working properly as intended, and reauthorize it if they so choose. That is the federal JCPA. I know we're going to get into the status and its questioning. There are also state-based efforts in the United States, and I will flag that what is different than the federal congressional efforts is that the states do not have authority or jurisdiction over federal antitrust laws. So rather than an antitrust exemption, states like California, New York, Illinois are focused on usage-based models of, okay, we know that sites are being accessed and consumed through these digital platforms. We're going to measure that. We're going to develop a rate structure, and sites will need to compensate broadcasters and other news publishers for that usage on their platforms. I will flag with 50 states and even more territories, this is not a one-size-fits-all or a market bending proposal. Each state would only have jurisdiction and framework over their own states. They may create precedent elsewhere, but it would be partial solutions state by state. So we continue to press on the JCPA in the United States and have a lot of positive momentum.
Thank you, Sean. And now, our president of Canadian Association of Broadcasters, Kevin Desjardins, is correct?
Close enough. I don't know how to pronounce it half the time, so it depends on what company I'm keeping. But the R got rolled enough there that it's pretty close to how we pronounce it in French. So Thank you. So thank you so much. Obrigado e bom dia. That's the extent of my Portuguese. So I just, off the top, just wanted to say what an appreciation I have for the moment of being in this room today with all of you, to be able to share our experience that we've had in Canada. I think Australia was sort of at the leading edge, and we kind of came in afterwards. I think one of the things though that I'm really grateful to hear is the alignment, hearing many of the same things that I've been saying in Canada over the last 4 years, and to sort of hear those same arguments talking about asymmetrical regulation, talking about leveling the playing field. Sometimes you can feel when you're the only person in your country who's out doing these things that you're a bit alone. So it's good to hear those arguments here. And I think one of the real key things to understand is that our competitors are global. And so, as such, the challenges that we're having are universal. And I think that they're the challenges that are going to be in every country around the world. And as such, we need global alignment on these things. We need to make sure that we are doing our best to align our efforts, and as has been stated numerous times today, that it's really our democracies that are at stake. And so that's and that was something that when I spoke to the Minister of Canadian Heritage, who is the member of our cabinet who is responsible for the broadcasting sector. I spoke to her not long before coming down here, and that was the one thing that she really wanted to emphasize was the need for all of our countries to work together, and for that very reason, preserving our democratic institutions. I say often that I feel like I wake up each day and keeping journalists in newsrooms is the goal of what I'm doing on any particular day, and I think that as Sean very outlined very well, news is expensive to create because it takes people, it takes resources to do news well. The more that those resources are eroded, the harder it is for those vital truths to be brought out. And the other challenge is not just that it's expensive to do news, but it's hard to monetize at times. People want to see the news, but advertisers don't always want to advertise against the news. So, people don't want to come out, have their advertisements be in the break right after, all of the trouble in the world has just been brought out. So again, I think the challenges are universal. I want to give you a really quick summary of where things stand in Canada. There were 2 pieces of legislation that over the last 4 years have made their way through our legislative process and are now in the process of being implemented. One was the Online Streaming Act, and that basically captures global entertainment streaming services in our requires them to register, requires them to pay fees to our regulator, and to support to support aspects of the Canadian broadcasting system. That is a process that is still ongoing. I'll come back to that in a moment. The other one was the Online News Act, and it is very similar in both in goal and in structure to the JCPA. here in the United States. It was intended to create a bit of a fair negotiation framework between broadcasters or any news business, I should say, not just broadcasters, but any news business and the global platforms. Obviously, there is a massive imbalance between the global platforms and any particular news business. And so what it was hoping to create was a framework for negotiation. So both of those bills have passed, and as I said, that they are in the process of being implemented. What I will tell you is, and I've appreciated some of the congratulations that I've received for us helping to get those bills passed, and I guess sometimes you need to recognize the work that you put in. But what I will tell you is that this is going to be incredibly challenging. That the global platforms are going to resist working on anybody else's terms. That they are, so you really need to prepare for a fight. A key value of the global tech companies is disruption. And I will tell you that they are going to do everything in their power to disrupt your democracy when it comes to legislation that applies to them. For us, on one of these pieces of legislation, it meant bringing in 60 different YouTube creators to our Senate committee that was reviewing the legislation. Each of them clearly provided with talking points from YouTube, misrepresenting what the legislation's impact was, misrepresenting the potential impact that it could have on them. And to be honest, one of the real challenges, as much as these bills are about helping the free press, you're going to need to work with the free press to get them to understand what these bills are and what they aren't. And that was one of our big challenges, was that the press was not grasping this, or was buying into some of the narratives opposing it. There were experts that the global platforms were able to access, academics, those sorts of people who were speaking against this legislation, and again, misrepresenting it. And the other piece is that news blocking is real. And I will say that if I have a piece of criticism about the way that I approached this over the last few years, it was that I did not take the threat of news blocking as seriously as I should have. That I felt as though ultimately the companies would not be able to do that without significant pushback from Canadians. There is no news currently available in Canada on Facebook and on Instagram. It has been blocked, and what I would say is that the response of the Canadian people is by and large a shrug. So some of that speaks to the quality of the news feed, and it's ironic that it's called a news feed still, but the news feed for Facebook and what it had become over time. But Facebook had walked away from the table in Canada. We hope that with global pressure, with other countries, with the US or Brazil or other large G20 countries being able to push back, that they may potentially come back to the table, but as of yet, there is no indication that they will. On the Online News Act and Google, it has been a little more willing to work with us, but I will say that they used news blocking as leverage against the government. And so again, it's ironic that what we were attempting to do with that piece of legislation was to even the ability to negotiate with the global giants on the value of journalism and the value provided to them by news businesses. What Google was able to do was to take the threat of news blocking and to use that to negotiate with our government to get an exemption from the legislation. So they agreed to pay $100 million into a single collective that will redistribute out from there. For a room full of broadcasters, I will tell you that they came to the table and said that they want broadcasters out. They only want to support print news. So that's another challenge that you'll have. The $100 million right now is split $63 million to print news businesses, $30 million to broadcast, and $7 million to our public broadcaster, the CBC Radio Canada. So that's the reality of where we are. I hope I'm not a downer, but at the same time, I kind of hope that I am. I really do think that you have to be ready for a fight. One of the good pieces that our government managed to slip into their agreement with Google on the $100 million was, if any other country gets a better deal, we get to match that deal. So, I think that is one thing that if they do come back and if, $100 million is a round number, so maybe they figure that there's 9 Canadas in the US, or there's, I want to say 30 Canadas in Brazil. My math might be bad. But in any case, that's sort of the baseline that they're using. We do hope that that you're able to move things forward and that we can all benefit in the end.
Thank you, David. Well, I make some questions for you. First, to Charles. The Journalism, Competition and Preservation Act, em português não, sorry, que atualmente está na Comissão de Justiça do Senado, além de permitir o uso de conteúdo jornalístico mediante remuneração, também foi pensado como uma forma de garantir a sustentabilidade do jornalismo profissional norte-americano, principalmente das emissoras locais. Ainda como está a tramitação deste Journalism Competition and Preservation Act e qual a perspectiva de sua aprovação pelo Congresso norte-americano?
Well, thank you, and I'm going to start where Kevin left off a bit, which is on this news blocking point. And we were proud to join with the Canadian broadcasters in decrying that action by the dominant platforms. A similar thing has happened in the state of California as well, and unfortunately these aren't the only 2 jurisdictions where we've seen it. I raise this to relay, this got the attention of US policymakers. And if you ever needed evidence of the extreme market power of these companies, and I would say their value structure, look at their news blocking to gain leverage through legislative processes. And so in the United States, where we're focused on antitrust and the competition perspective, we had leading champions of the Journalism Competition Preservation Act saying, Canada is on fire. There are tremendous forest fires. California is flooding. There are major floods. And yet you had Facebook in particular saying, that's okay, we'll let our users the consumer eat cake effectively. They can find out what's happening, with your family and friends, but entertainment, news, not critical information. And so there is a tremendous irony that remains called the news feed, but this is something that I would argue has created more resolve and momentum in the United States to get something done. It is still a challenging landscape. So we've passed the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act. Curtis mentioned the nearly 24 co-sponsors to the bipartisan bill in the Senate, out of the Senate Judiciary Committee, which is the key committee of jurisdiction, and that matches the action that was taken in the last Congress, and that puts us in a position to either get considered on the Senate floor or as part of, I would argue, a broader package on big tech, or frankly, other must-pass legislation. And it was that latter scenario that really gave rise to, at the end of the last Congress, a very real debate and effort to send this bill to the president's desk. We do have some critics, and I don't want to diminish the sincerity of their policy concerns. We have principally Republican policymakers who don't believe in antitrust exemptions in the United States. They would say, well, either we shouldn't have these types of competition laws in the first place, or we need a different mechanism. But creating a patchwork, if you will, is contrary to their philosophical views. Republicans control the House of Representatives. So this is a challenge in this Congress, but I'll say it is not impossible that the United States Senate could attach the JCPA to some broader legislation, and it would go to the House, potentially pass the House because of the momentum. And the same Republicans who disfavor an antitrust exemption are still very sympathetic to the underlying issue here in our cause. So they may be willing to, in effect, swallow this policy prescription, given that it's voluntary in nature, mostly market-based, and limited in time nature. So that's our strategy, and I think we will continue to ramp up pressure in our efforts as we approach the election and potentially a post-election. Here in the United States, we call it the lame duck period, where after the election, typically a lot of must-pass bills are packaged together and sent to the president's desk, all as one.
Thank you. And now, Kevin, a Lei de Notícias, recentemente aprovada pelo governo canadense, estabeleceu que cabe à Comissão Canadense de Rádio, Televisão e Telecomunicações a responsabilidade por supervisionar a estrutura da negociação. Você poderia falar um pouco mais sobre como funcionou a criação desta comissão, sua composição e atuação? E, no seu ponto de vista, a recente chamada pública feita pelo Google, com prazo de até 30 de abril para inscrição das empresas noticiosas em relação à lei de notícias online, foi exitosa?
Thank you. And thank you to our simultaneous translators, by the way. That's one of the hardest jobs in the world, so so thank you for that. So the responsibility for overseeing the implementation of the Online News Act does go to our communications regulator, the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission. And at present, they are going through their processes to create the regulatory framework. But as I said earlier, at present, they are also going to be asked for an exemption from the framework by Google in view of the $100 million that Google is going to provide to be distributed. So it's kind of a strange situation in that they're creating a regulatory framework that is not necessarily going to be used. And the Canadian legislation was narrow enough that initially only Facebook and Google were going to be captured under this. So, we still support the fact that the regulator needs to create that framework so that if there are other companies that meet the thresholds and that are going to be captured by the legislation, that they either are required to enter into agreements with news businesses, or that they have to come up with a way to get an exemption from the legislation. So it's a backstop. It's there to make sure that that there is some sort of negotiating pressure. In terms of what Google did recently, that is a part of the process where they did an open call for all news businesses to identify themselves as eligible to receive the funds that would be distributed. They also have said that they only want to work with a single collective. They only want to cut one check. I said to them, the amounts are already defined in policy direction, that it's 63 million, 30 million, 7 million. Why not cut 3 checks and then make life easy for the rest of us? And despite what they would tell you, I don't think that they're in the make life easy for at least us business. So I will say that one of the things that we have been doing is there is an association that works with the print media, which is called News Media Canada, and our good friends at the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. We're sort of frenemies. We get along some days more than others, but we're working with them. So the 3 of us have got together, worked on developing a joint collective, one that would have an immediate pass-through to the 3 entities, and then would help to distribute the money from there. It's a lot of work on our part. It's a significant challenge. In this phase right now, Google has been has been pretty good to work with, honestly, now that we've got some definitions there. But so is it a success? I think that we're still a ways away and from knowing how successful these things are going to be. Look, there's not a dollar that's been put into a newsroom based on these pieces of legislation yet in Canada. As Sean was noting, like sometimes this legislation moves very slowly, and the regulatory processes can move very slowly. We are constantly telling our regulator that it's urgent that they address these things, and I think talking to your regulators beforehand and letting them know how urgent the need is to keep journalists in newsrooms is something that would be helpful.
Okay, well, my dear fellows, the time is almost over, but I have one question more for you. Como o uso não autorizado de conteúdo jornalístico pela inteligência artificial preocupa as suas entidades dentro desse contexto de remuneração de conteúdo para as emissoras? Please, the question is for both of us.
I will start, thank you. Generative AI exacerbates every problem and concern that we've discussed in the United States as part of the context of the GCPA and these similar efforts in other jurisdictions. I believe this actually does create the urgency in policymakers are registering that, at least in the United States, to act more quickly than maybe they were already on a trajectory. In the United States, we're focused on three key concerns, and Curtis has testified on behalf of the NAB, both before a Senate Committee of Jurisdiction, as well as a special working group led by Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer. The first issue is very similar to the JCPA, and it goes to fair compensation. It is the ingestion of our news content to train these large language models without our authorization, permission, and certainly no compensation. It is something that Congress is very focused on the problem, but doesn't yet know how to resolve. And there are ongoing legal challenges in the United States that focus on key questions of United States copyright. Next key policy issue is, as Curtis mentioned, digital replicas or deepfakes of our very trusted on-air news talent. So I mentioned local news is the most trusted source of news in the United States. Imagine you're in DC, local, again, WJLA anchor is deepfaked and presents false news, misinformation, disinformation prior to the election about access to key voting sites in the Washington, D.C. area. We're very concerned about that, obviously for what it means for our audience's trust in our content, sort of sanctity of our news anchors and journalists, brands and personas, but also what that can mean for our democratic processes. And the final thing is this question of resources. Generative AI, once it ingests all of our content without permission, it is using that model is being used to, in many instances, produce new information that competes with us. And if it is misinformation or disinformation, well, guess whose newsrooms need to wade through that and present fact-based reporting and truth to our audiences. So the risk of sounding sort of hyperbolic, I think this is a generative AI arms race where newsrooms will need even more resources to deliver the truth to our audiences. And that is, when you go full circle, a major challenge if one of the fundamental concerns is how will you be able to partner with these platforms for fair compensation and reinvest in that same newsroom.
Thank you. And this is an area that we're just starting to look at this point. There is some study being done in Canada. I think that if I can take this back to the initial discussion, one of the challenges that we had in working with the large global players was that they would say, we're not deriving any value from your content. We're actually providing value to you through the traffic. I think that there is a bit of an opportunity potentially with AI to show how those AI companies are generating value through our content. I don't think that they're going to offer it up easily. But I mean, there's just a host of issues and challenges that come out. Everything from, you know, the lack of remuneration for the content that went into training, not just text-based, but also it's training on a video basis as well. And that's one of the things that occasionally the global tech platforms will play dumb about, and they'll say, well, this is all just about text, and they know that these things are able to make use of video as well and to generate video and photos and what have you. So I think that there is an opportunity to show that there is value that is being generated by these AI companies, and that value should be returned in some way. I don't doubt that it's going to be just as much of a challenge, though, as it was through the aggregators and social media platforms.
And who are the principal investors in these generative AI platforms? The same big tech platforms.
Well, it's the end of our job. And thank you, Kevin, and thank you, Sean. It's a pleasure to work with you. And I hope to invite you another time. Okay? Well, thank you. Obrigado a todos. E está encerrado esta parte do painel.
Thank you all for the outstanding debate. It's now time for a coffee break. In a few minutes, we will resume the panel. The new competition scenario in the media industry, asymmetries, big tech, regulatory framework, and other initiatives. We'll be back in 15 minutes.